On the evening of the 27th of January, 1986, about 34 people got on a conference call. They were spread across three sites: a plant in Utah, a space center in Alabama, a launch complex in Florida, and they were talking about the weather. A cold front had come through central Florida. The forecast for the morning was 18 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, and somewhere around 30 at the moment of launch. That would make it the coldest launch anyone had ever attempted, by a margin of about 20 degrees. The engineers who built the rocket boosters did not want to fly. They said so on the call with charts. 14 hours later, the shuttle launched anyway, and 73 seconds after that it came apart over the Atlantic in front of a crowd that included the families of the crew and a great many schoolchildren watching on television, because there was a teacher on board. It matters who that teacher was, because it explains the pressure. Krista McAuliffe was a social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, picked out of 11,000 applicants to be the first ordinary civilian in space. She had lessons planned to broadcast from orbit. Schools across the country had wheeled televisions into classrooms for the launch. And the shuttle program, which had been sold to Congress as a reusable vehicle that would fly dozens of times a year, was running badly behind. This flight had already been scrubbed or delayed 4 times in 6 days. None of that is an excuse for anything, but it is the weather system the decision was made inside. Everything about what went wrong physically was understood before it happened. It was written down. It had been written down for years. So the question this video is about is not what failed. The question is how a room full of people who knew the answer talked themselves into the opposite one, and it turns out you can watch it happen, almost minute by minute, because the whole thing is on the record. Start with the hardware, because you need one piece of it. The shuttle's 2 solid rocket boosters were too big to ship in one piece, so they were built as segments and stacked at the launch site. Each place where 2 segments met was called a field joint, and each field joint was sealed with 2 rubber O-rings, one primary, one backup, sitting in grooves, with heat-resistant putty packed in front of them. When the booster ignited, pressure inside would push the joint slightly open, a movement of a few hundredths of an inch, and in that instant the O-ring had to spring outward fast enough to fill the gap before hot gas got past it. Rubber, when it gets cold, gets stiff. A stiff O-ring is slow. That is the entire failure, and it is not complicated, and it was known. It was known because it had already been happening. Boosters were recovered from the ocean after every flight and taken apart, and inspectors kept finding O-rings that were scorched, eroded, or showing soot blown past them. It did not happen on every flight. It happened often enough to have a name, blow-by, and a chart, and there was a pattern in that chart. The worst damage anyone had ever seen came from a launch in January of 1985, at 53 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest launch to date. On that flight, both the primary and secondary O-rings on one joint were blackened by hot gas. In July 1985, an engineer at Morton Thiokol named Roger Boisjoly wrote a memo about it. He was blunt in a way engineers are usually trained not to be. He wrote that if the problem was not fixed, the result would be a catastrophe of the highest order, and he used the phrase loss of human life. A task force was formed. It was, by the accounts of the people on it, under-resourced and going nowhere. 6 months later, they were on that phone call. Here is the thing to hold onto about that call. The engineer's position going into it was not a hunch. It was that they had never flown below 53 degrees. They had seen the worst damage at exactly 53 degrees, and tomorrow was going to be far colder than that. Bob Lund, the vice president of engineering at Thiokol, put up a chart with a recommendation on it: do not launch below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. And then something happened that is the actual subject of this story. NASA pushed back. Larry Mullen, who managed the booster program at Marshall Space Flight Center, said the data did not support that limit, and he was, in a narrow technical sense, not wrong. The correlation between temperature and damage was messy. Some cold flights had been fine. Some warm flights had shown erosion. The engineers were arguing from a small number of data points and from physical intuition about cold rubber, and they had not been given the time or the budget to run the tests that would have made the case airtight. So Mullen asked a question that sounds reasonable and is actually the hinge of the whole thing. He asked them to prove it was unsafe. That is the burden of proof running backwards. In every flight readiness review before that night, the contractor had to show the hardware was safe to fly. Now the contractor was being asked to show it was certain to fail, and no engineer can ever prove that, because engineering does not deal in certainties, it deals in margins. The moment the question flipped, the answer was going to be launch, no matter what the charts said. And Molloy said one more thing, which people remember because of how it sounded. My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch next April? Thiokol asked to go offline. They asked for 5 minutes. They took about 30. In that room in Utah, the argument continued with the phone muted. Boisjoly and another engineer, Arnie Thompson, got up and pushed photographs of the damaged joints in front of the senior managers and kept talking until it was obvious that nobody was moving. Then they sat down. Boisjoly later said he stopped because he had realized he was not going to change anyone's mind and there was nothing left to say. Then Jerry Mason, a senior vice president, turned to Bob Lund, the same Lund who had put the 53-degree limit on the screen an hour earlier, and said, "Take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat." Lund changed his position. The 4 senior managers polled themselves. The engineers were not asked to vote, and the recommendation to launch was signed by Joe Kilminster and sent by fax. One person refused to sign it. Alan McDonald was Thiokol's senior representative at the Cape, sitting in a room in Florida, and when the paperwork came, he would not put his name on it. He said afterwards that he would not want to have to explain that signature to a board of inquiry. He was right that there would be one. Overnight, the temperature dropped to about 18 degrees. The launch pad had water lines running to protect against freezing, and they had been left trickling. By morning, the structure was hung with icicles, some of them a foot and a half long, and the ice team went out 3 separate times to look at it. The concern being discussed that morning was ice breaking loose and striking the orbiter's tiles. The joints were not on the agenda anymore. That decision had been made and closed the night before. The shuttle launched at 11:38 in the morning on the 28th of January. The right-hand booster's aft field joint failed at ignition. Cameras later showed a puff of black smoke coming out of the joint in the first second, the primary O-ring, too cold and too slow, letting gas past. Then the smoke stopped. What almost certainly happened is that the burnt debris and putty jammed into the gap and sealed it, by luck, as a kind of accidental plug. For about 50 seconds that plug held. Then the vehicle hit the strongest wind shear ever encountered on a shuttle flight, the joint flexed, and the plug came out. A flame appeared on the side of the booster at 58 seconds. It grew, swung around, and played across the strut, holding the booster to the big external fuel tank and across the tank's own skin. At 72 seconds, the strut let go, the booster rotated, and the tank ruptured. At 73 seconds, the whole stack was engulfed and torn apart by aerodynamic forces at nearly twice the speed of sound. The crew cabin came out of the cloud intact. It was found later that at least 3 of the emergency air packs had been switched on, which means somebody in that cabin was conscious and moving after the vehicle broke up, and the cabin fell for about 2.5 minutes before it hit the water. Francis Scobie, Michael Smith, Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, Ronald McNair, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe were killed. The commission that followed had a physicist on it named Richard Feynman, who got tired of being managed and did something in a public hearing that took about a minute. He took a piece of the same O-ring rubber, squeezed it in a small clamp, dropped it into his glass of ice water, pulled it out, and showed that it did not spring back. That was the whole case in front of cameras, using tap water and ice. Feynman also wrote a separate appendix to the report because he did not agree with its tone. In it, he noted that NASA management was quoting odds of catastrophic failure of about 1 in 100,000, while the engineers working on the same hardware estimated something closer to 1 in 100. He ended it with a line that has outlived the report. For successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. And that is why this story stays useful, and why it is worth being precise about what actually happened on that call. Nobody in it was a villain. Molloy was applying a standard of evidence that would be perfectly sensible in almost any other context. Mason was under real schedule pressure from a program that had promised a flight rate it could not meet. Lund was being asked to think about the whole company, which is genuinely part of his job. Every individual step has a defense. What has no defense is the shape of the thing. The people closest to the hardware said no, in writing, with charts. The burden of proof was quietly reversed so that no was no longer available as an answer. The dissenters were removed from the vote, and the man who refused to sign was the only one who came out of it with nothing to explain. 14 hours after that call ended, 7 people were strapped into a vehicle whose most experienced engineers had spent the previous evening trying to keep on the ground.